After looking at literally hundreds of boats from California, Florida and the Caribbean, we finally settled for the Mediterranean, which for health reasons was the best option. We had flown to Nice to catch the plane to Corsica, where a British-owned Moody 40 was moored. We had a couple of days to spare, so we hired a car to see the sights of Monaco. This is the entrance to the famous tunnel. The bronze Formula One car is near the entrance. Walking around the harbour, the gym palaces were being prepared for the new season. Roger Moore's house is behind where Margaret is standing. The flight from Nice to Calvi airport went without a hitch, and we were soon in the owner's car on the way to Calvi Marina. Because of the extortionate cost of a professional survey, I had decided to do my own. After owning 3 previous yachts and looking at hundreds, I thought I knew it all. As it turned out, this was a bad decision. Fox Hunt, as the boat was called, was in the water, moored stern to, which is the usual way to moor a boat in the Med. We had previously seen video and various pictures, so we knew what to expect. The remainder of the first of our 3 days on Corsica was spent checking out the living accommodation, the engine and navigation equipment. The owners were obviously well versed in showing off the boat, and my difficult questions were skillfully avoided. The boat was what I would describe as tired. The engine room in particular was in a dreadful state. However, it was the spacious living accommodation that had led us to choose to commit to come to Corsica to see her. So I was mentally totting up what it would cost to bring her to the standard to tackle ocean voyages. The engine alone would cost in excess of £5,000. We had arranged to stay on board for 3 days while I was carrying out the survey, and had been allocated the spacious aft cabin. Storage is obviously at a premium on a liveaboard yacht, and I couldn't fault Fox Hunt for that. She was obviously well built, but everywhere my mental calculator was clicking away with items that needed replacing. The upholstery and carpets would be more at home in a Victorian drawing room than a seagoing yacht. The main cabin or saloon also contained the galley or kitchen and the navigation station. The vessel was supposed to have been built in 1984, and it looked as though nothing had been replaced since then. My expectations were rapidly leaking away. Dinner on board that evening was a boozy affair, with the whisky bottle much in evidence. The more the owner drank, the more aggressive he got at my questions. I was rapidly going off fox hunting. Following a night of broken sleep, we had breakfast and motored the boat round to the marina yard so she could be lifted out to check her bottom. Surprisingly, she was in better condition than below. The owner was of Irish descent and had obviously kissed the Blarney Stone. His skillful avoidance of my awkward questions was akin to our present politicians. The below the waterline survey took most of the day, so after she was back in the water at her berth, I checked out the mast, rigging and decks. By this time, my mental calculator had clocked up £12,000 of replacements. The owner getting more inebriated and aggressive. In bed afterwards, I dropped the bombshell to Margaret. The boat wasn't worth anywhere near the asking price, and we were going to walk away without even making an offer. She was devastated. She'd been planning how she would bring the boat up to her standards. After breakfast the following morning, I broke the news to the owner, who obviously thought I was hooked. His wife was almost in tears as I let rip with both barrels about the state of the boat. My closing remarks being I wouldn't even consider making an offer without the price being reduced by 30%. This sobered the owner somewhat, and we agreed to take them to dinner that evening to compensate for their hospitality. With that, we left and booked into one of the hotels for the remaining night on the island. We then spent the remainder of the day wandering around Calvi. Following a quiet dinner where the owner ordered bottle after bottle of wine as he wasn't footing the bill. As we rose to leave, he dropped his bombshell. "We will accept your offer." It was my turn to be gobsmacked, as I hadn't made an offer. He was, however, willing to deduct 30% from the asking price. We returned to our hotel for a conference. His conditions were that they be allowed to remain on board until I retired at the end of May. I agreed on the proviso he paid his marina fees until we took over at the beginning of June. He declined giving us a lift back to the fast ferry, but came to the harbour to see us off. We were back in Nice in 2 hours and on a plane back to Liverpool, arriving home about 4 p.m, when the thought hit me, what had I done? Retirement and family parties followed, and we bought an old estate car to bring our possessions from England. Then set off back across France to Nice to catch the slow ferry back to Corsica. The owners were on the dock to meet us. No welcoming smiles this time. They had booked a hotel room for us to stay in while we overhauled the yacht in the yard. Next morning we were supposed to be on board for the trip around to the yard. Arriving at the agreed time, we saw them motoring across the marina to the lift-out point. I had insisted I make an inspection before handing over the balance of the money. So the boat was lifted out and we went aboard. I could smell trouble as we faced each other in the 35-degree heat across the cockpit. I had expected to take the rest of the day inspecting the inventory and condition, but they had other plans, claiming they had an appointment elsewhere. By this time we were melting in the heat, so after a brief look around to ensure all was well, we completed the Part 1 bill of sale documents and I handed over the balance by banker's draft. He then said he wanted an additional £300 for the fuel in the tanks and the spare parts. My hackles rose and I told them to get off my boat, and they hurriedly departed. I then realised the keys were missing, so I chased after them but was unable to stop them boarding a friend's yacht and sailing out of the harbour, laughing at me on the dock. We spent the rest of the day getting our gear aboard. I also found out that the ship's registration documents were missing. This took the gilt off the gingerbread and set the tone for our remaining time on Corsica. It took us 3 weeks to clean and anti-foul the hull to get her ready for the water. Not having sailed the boat, it would be traumatic motoring her around to the berth we had been allocated. As it happened, we managed to get the propeller entangled 3 times before finally mooring up at our berth. We had 6 weeks to prepare the boat before our first visitor from home. Jonathan, an ex-colleague from work, had booked an 8-day holiday with us. The first major problem we found were the heads, which are the toilets. The previous owner had suggested I bring out a couple of repair kits for them. After fitting the first kit, it was obvious the heads were knackered, so 2 replacements were ordered from one of the island chandlers. This was the start of a sorry tale of replacements. In all, we spent over £5,000 before the boat was fit for sea, which was a large dent in our resources. After overhauling the oily beast, as the engine became known, we were ready for our visitor. He obviously wanted to get as much sailing in as possible, but luckily the weather was somewhat inclement, with the Corsican version of the Mistral blowing for the first 3 days. Eventually, the wind subsided and we set sail for Galleria, a bay about 30 miles from Calvi where we planned to spend the night. The cruiser in the background is the Oriana, which apparently was a regular visitor. We arrived safely, anchored, and Margaret grilled sardinas for lunch. After lunch, as the weather was so good, we decided to up anchor and sail further down the coast. I started the engine to motor out of the bay when it happened. Screech! Bang! And the engine stopped. We were drifting onto some rocks, so while Jonathan and Margaret raised the sails, I inspected the oily beast. I had changed the oil and fuel filters, filled it with oil, so I knew it should be okay. I then checked the gearbox. It was empty. The only thing I hadn't checked, after owning 3 previous boats, I had never had to add oil to a gearbox. I concluded it was knackered. I rushed back on deck. The crew had managed to sail away from the rocks, but the wind wasn't favourable to sail back to Calvi, so I decided to re-anchor and take stock. After many phone calls, I managed to get Felipe, the boat mechanic, to drive to Galleria and inspect the gearbox. Eventually he arrived and confirmed my diagnosis. The gearbox was knackered. I drove back to Calvi with him and collected our car, arranged a tow for the following day at an extortionate rate of £7,500 French francs, which is around £750. I phoned my insurance company and their advice was to accept the tow. Monsieur Villain, or Villain, yes, that was his name, arrived in his boat at 10 a.m. the following day. He towed us back into Calvi Harbour, then managed to get a rope around his prop and cast us loose. Luckily we drifted to the harbour wall and moored up. Eventually we got the other chandler, Roncho, to tow us back to our berth with his speedboat. To compensate Jonathan for the curtailment of his sailing holiday, I lent him our car and he toured the island. I arranged for Felipe to remove the gearbox. Quote from Hearth, France, was 6,000 French francs for reconditioning and 10,000 for a new one. I told him to order the new one. We had now been on the island 3 months, and our funds were hemorrhaging away. The saying, "a boat is a hole in the water to throw money into," was very true. We had now spent over £5,000 and still had to change the engine. We were given a couple of steaks from these tuna, and Margaret produced sensational meals of parmesan-crusted tuna. We set off for the French mainland, which was 105 nautical miles away. It was now the 17th of October. The 17-hour overnight voyage was a nightmare, keeping the engine running. There wasn't enough wind to sail, and darkness fell around 7 p.m. I called the marina on the VHF, so we entered and moored alongside the Capitainery. It was 3 a.m. We had made it. I could see the security guards playing cards. Eventually they saw us, and after much gesticulating and broken French, we were allocated a berth. Unbeknownst to me, in the expensive section. At 4:30 a.m. we crawled into our bed, shattered but elated. We had managed to nurse Magic Moods, as she is now known, which is an anagram of our names, the 105 miles to the Golfe de Lyon. Our middle daughter had just given birth to her first child, so we made a quick trip back to the UK to see Alex and his mother. 2 weeks later we were back, ready to commence our search for the new engine. Eventually, on the 16th of November, we set sail for Port Grimaud in Saint-Tropez Bay, some 5 hours and 30 miles away. The wind was 25 knots on the nose, so the Iron Donkey, or Oily Beast, was called on to get us there. We arrived at the marina office at 1:30 p.m. and it was closed. What with the weather, illness and mechanical problems, it was the 23rd of December before we eventually left, and that was only to the adjacent marina, Marines de Cogolin. We had made an attempt to set off for our next destination, Yers. Got halfway across the bay when the engine started to protest, so we turned around and came back. I was discussing our problem with the engine with the captain of the marina. He suggested a local mechanic may be able to fit a new engine. Margaret had taken to her bed with a severe dose of flu. The morning arrived for the lift out. Dirty Boots' assistant rang to say the yard was closed for Christmas, but had procured a place in another yard in Saint-Tropez, 5 miles across the bay. We gingerly motored across to Saint-Tropez to the proposed lift-out point. I was horrified when I saw the crane he proposed to use, and after a full-blown row, gave him the sack, and we went back to Port Grimaud. I asked the Capitan for a place nearer the shops, but there weren't any, so we made our way to Marines de Cogolin, next door, which is where we spent a stormy Christmas. After Christmas, Hood Sales rang to say the new foresail was ready, so he arrived next day to fit it, which brightened things a little. On New Year's Eve we left for Yers, only to be forced back into the bay, so we entered Saint-Tropez Marina once more to spend New Year waiting for more clement weather. The cost, a pleasantly surprising £7 per night, including electricity. That would rise to £50 a night in the summer. On the 3rd of January we set off for Yers, which incidentally is spelt Hyres. Hearts in mouths, would we get out of Saint-Tropez Bay this time? the wind rising to 30 knots. I could see a vacant space at the fueling dock, so I swung the wheel to port and we shot in like a rat up a drain pipe. Throwing the engine into reverse, we managed to stop before running into the other boat ahead of us. We checked in, got our berth number and reversed into our place, giving our neighbour's berthing ladder a clout before arriving. The wind had now risen to 40 knots and we were in danger of hitting the dock, so I had to tighten the moorings in driving rain to make us safe. During dinner I could hear the steady drip, drip of water. On investigation I found the water pump bearing shot and leaking like a sieve. A further saga ensued, culminating in sourcing a new pump, fitting it, and finally 3 days later resuming our voyage. Next destination, Toulon, 30 miles away. The weather was sunny, but the rough seas from the previous storm gave a 3-metre swell, making the trip uncomfortable. Eventually we arrived in Toulon Bay, and the swell ceased. Toulon is the largest natural harbour in the Med, and is home to the French naval fleet, as well as about 6 marinas. Turning to starboard brought us into the channel leading to the inner harbour and our marina destination. Little did we know we would be stuck here for almost 3 months. We tied up to the fuel pontoon with the help of a bearded Frenchman named Alain. I nicknamed him Alain Delon after the film star. He became a good friend. After inviting him aboard for drinks, he told us of a mechanic who could fit our engine. He rang us next day saying, "Monsieur Shepherd, your engine is not in Paris. It was delivered to Saint-Tropez." Panic, panic. On the 8th of February, Christian rang to say the engine had arrived. Thank God. We moved the boat around the corner for the crane to lift out the old engine. In doing so, I found there was a problem with the new gearbox. It was failing to engage. Would it never end? Next day the steering was removed and the hatch lifted to reveal the oily beast to its first light of day since 1984. During the disconnection, Christian managed to wreck the coupling between the propeller shaft and gearbox. His assistant claimed it would repair easily. I was sceptical and contacted the manufacturer, Aguadulce, who informed me the coupling should be changed every 10 years as a matter of course. I ordered a replacement, which delayed the new engine being fitted and cost £200. Maybe they had done me a favour wrecking the old one. As the gearbox integrity was in doubt, I asked Christian to take it to the agents for checking. The agent confirmed it was faulty, but would repair it under warranty. It would take 10 days. In the meantime, I decided to give the engine room a makeover, ripping off the decaying soundproofing and painting the room brilliant white gloss. Christian discovered the engine mounting centres differed, so I had to modify the engine bearers to suit the new engine. Thornycroft's had assured me they would match the old engine. You can't trust anyone. After 10 days the gearbox was ready and the new coupling arrived. I gave Christian strict instructions about aligning it and gave him a copy of the maker's instructions. By this time our relationship was at the lowest ebb. The crane arrived and lifted the new engine into position. I kept checking progress, but I could see they were not following instructions. I was having my afternoon zizz when I heard the hatch cover being lowered and screwed down. I shot around to the engine room and found they had mounted the engine well out of alignment. Upon deck and told them what I thought of their antics and ordered them off the boat. This was becoming a habit. We were now up the creek without a paddle or a mechanic. Next morning I visited the local bricolage, which is B&Q to us, and bought some specialist tools to remount the engine myself. I had already done a complete rewire in preparation. 6 hours later the engine was in the correct position and ready for connection. Unfortunately, Thornycroft had neglected to provide the fuel connections, more delays and expense. 2 more days delay and everything was connected. I turned the key to start the fuel pump to bring the fuel into the filters and stopped immediately. The fuel was contaminated. Another 24 hours delay cleaning the tank and fitting a new filter system. Next day I tried again. Click, the starter wasn't engaging. I checked the new wiring loom and found a spade connection loose. I pushed it home, turned the key, and the 40 horsepower 4-cylinder Mitsubishi Thornycroft roared into life. This called for a champagne celebration. What I have just related is a brief synopsis of what actually went on. The full details are in my electronic book of the same name. The red gas bottle picture is there to illustrate an attempt to rob us by a local youth gang, which was our only sign of violence throughout the whole trip. The Chinese meal was a thank you to our friends who helped us. On the 17th of March 2002, we motored out of the Rade de Toulon, the smell of hot paint in our nostrils from the new engine. We had been too long in Toulon. Our destination, a brief 25 miles away, La Ciotat. Alain Delon cast us off, and our new friends waved us off, but we were not sad to leave. Our jinx, however, was following us. We arrived in La Ciotat and managed to clout the concrete dock. Obviously, we were out of practice. La Ciotat was well worth a visit, the old town being particularly picturesque. There were fires inland, and these planes were scooping water from the bay. However, we were on a mission. We had to get to our final destination in Spain by June, as our relatives were champing at the bit to come and visit. We were supposed to go to Almerimar in the Costa del Sol, but during a trip to the local internet cafe I found they had increased their prices. Alain Delon had suggested Aguadulce near Almeria as an alternative, but I left our options open. This guy was after my baguette, I think. From La Ciotat we were supposed to go to the Isle de Frion. However, a weather warning from a Coast Guard boat which pulled alongside dictated that we should cut the trip short, so we detoured to Cassis, where, if I had the money, I would live. As we were going to be weatherbound again, we got our hair attended to and visited the local calanques, which are inland locks, by someone else's boat. After a very pleasant visit, the weather eased and we were off again. This time, Saucet-le-Pan, 26 miles away. We were still running in the new engine, so short trips were the order of the day. Saucet is a lacklustre place. We were watching a movie that evening on TV when the electricity went off. I donned my dressing gown, made my way to the dock to sort the power, and managed to dislodge the water connection, which discharged a stream of cold water on my nether regions. I'll certainly not forget X-Files the movie. Port Guardian was our next stop, 36 miles west. We had to cross the Golfe de Lyon, which is notable as being the biggest polluter in the Med. There was a red haze in the air. On entering the channel into Port Guardian Marina, there was a buoy, which didn't have the colours denoting which side we were to pass it. We crawled past safely and tied up at the refuelling pontoon to fill up. I was feeling knackered. This supposed enjoyment really takes it out of you. In Port Guardian, the Spanish influence was much in evidence, with a bull ring, and they actually ran the bulls through the town to the bull ring while we were there, but we had left our camera on the boat, so we missed a shot. The Mistral returned with a vengeance. We were now entering the Golfe de Lyon, which is classed as the most dangerous stretch of water in the Mediterranean. The adverse weather delayed our departure for 6 days. The sun shone as we set off for Port Camargue, which is one of the state-owned supermarinas which surround the Golfe de Lyon. The 25-mile hop was relatively simple, and we arrived in bright sunshine. At the Capitanery, we were informed we could only stay for 2 days, as the marina was full. It actually holds 4,000 boats. It was a holiday weekend and there was a boat show at the other end of the marina. Margaret was feeling fragile, so I made my way alone to the show, having to force my way through the crowds. We returned the following day and bought some toilet additive, then made ready for the next leg, a 36-mile trip to Cap d'Argues. The weather the following morning had again taken a turn for the worse, so we knuckled down for the slogging to win. We were now in the centre of the Med-Bermuda Triangle, the Golfe de Lyon. Partway across, a tired finch landed on the anchor to rest. After 15 minutes it set off, probably heading for Africa. Cap d'Argues contains at least 6 marinas. So after negotiating the old Napoleonic fort de Bresco, we found the Aguadulce, or check-in. The wind was up to 20 knots by now, so after checking in we made our way to our berth about 2 miles away across the Etang, or inland sea. The price, a remarkable 45 francs per day. After 3 attempts to berth, we made it safely and tied up securely. The Navtex was forecasting a full-blown force 10 gale. We made our way into town to seek out a chandler to add to our stock of fenders. On the way, we heard music and were surprised to find a jazz band touring the streets, trying to drum up enthusiasm for a wet weekend. They stopped in the square to dance with the spectators.
Let's turn it on and get everybody thinking. Let's turn it on. Everybody song and dancing. Let's turn it on.
I, of course, had to join in. Margaret was a little disappointed with her partner. Remember the chip in the hull we acquired in La Ciotat? This is what a dose of plastic padding can do. Our next port, St Cyprian, 33 miles away down the coast. The overnight wind had left the boat covered in red dust blown across from Africa. The officials in the Capitanery looked at us pityingly as we signed out. We could hear the surf crashing on the breakwater behind the marine office, like the roar from a busy motorway. We had to surf through the entrance, round Fort de Bresco, then turn south. If you look carefully, you can just make out the liner, Lydia, which had been washed ashore in a previous gale some years ago. At this casino there's no gambling. However, after 15 miles of constant rain, we cut into St Cyprian. Bad mistake. The mooring method was unfamiliar. A floating buoy to attach the bow and a line to the dock for the stern. Next day around 4 a.m. all hell broke loose. It was a full-scale gale blowing. The stern was banging on the dock. I rushed on deck after donning my wet gear. A force 10 easterly was pushing us onto the concrete dock. Luckily, the new fenders from Cap d'Arc had been deployed and we hadn't suffered any damage as yet. I rushed forward to tighten the bow line. It was stretched bar tight and the mooring buoy was disappearing under the waves. I couldn't move it. I removed the fenders from the weather side and hung them from the stern, physically having to push them between the stern and the concrete dock. The surf was crashing over the seawall and we were in real danger of losing Magic Moods. The Capitanery opened at 10 a.m. We had been keeping the boat off the dock for 4 hours. I rushed inside and tried to explain our predicament. All I got was the French shrug. I sent Margaret off to find fenders at the chandlery a mile away. "Get the biggest you can," I called after her. We were like an accident in progress. An hour later, Margaret returned with a large ball and a teardrop fender. The wind had now risen to 45 knots, 38 on our wind indicator, which reads low. The occasional sightseer came and looked on pityingly, but none offered to help. At noon I went back into the Capitanery to ask for help. "It is too dangerous," was their reply. By this time we were physically drained. I took pictures of our predicament, expecting to have to prove what happened to our insurance company. At 3 p.m. I made one last attempt to get some assistance from the marineros. "If you don't help, I'm calling out the rescue services," I said. This had the desired effect. Within 10 minutes there were 3 of them on deck hauling in the bow line, and 2 in a powerboat bringing a line from one of the spare mooring buoys. We were saved. More prayers were offered. The following day was spent drying out and cleaning off the crud the wind had forced up the deck drains. It was now flat calm. So we took stock. Margaret ironed some washing while I tightened one of the engine fan belts, which had come loose for the second time. We had to get away from here. Too many bad memories. Although it was raining, the following day we set off for Port Wanderers, 8 miles across the bay. An incident halfway across when we passed a French naval ship lightened our mood. Its tradition to lower your ensign when passing a foreign ship. We lowered ours, and suddenly the wheelhouse door of the French ship shot open and instructions were bellowed to lower theirs. Port Vendres is a commercial port with a small marina, and the last but one before the Spanish border. After booking in, we heard a voice with a familiar accent coming from one of our neighbours. It was an Australian named Captain Rob. He did, however, introduce us to a diver who unblocked our deck drain. Margaret is holding the source of the blockage. Port Vendres is a pleasant place worthy of a revisit. It was now late April and we were due in southern Spain by June. So on the 24th we set off. Our next stop, Empuria Brava, in the Bay of Rosas. Captain Rod was just ahead in his boat, and we had arranged to call each other on the radio on the hour. We were happy to be leaving the dog poo capital of Europe, sad to miss the friends we had made. As we rounded Cabo Cruz, we crossed the Spanish border. I raised the new courtesy flag, and glory be, the sun came out. Empuria Brava is similar to Port Grimaud, a man-made Venice. There isn't much tidal rise in the Med. We were here. The first time since Corsica, the marinero helped us moor, which is customary in Spain. Of course, a tip is expected. I shook the marinero's hand and thanked him. He must have thought I was mad. What luxury! A visit to the supermarket in town revealed a wealth of English food, including Weetabix, Heinz beans and cornflakes, which had been off the menu for 8 months. We also bought a new ensign. We had been maxing 36 miles a day. The weather was hot, windless and sunny, so I set the autopilot and settled back for the long drag to Blaines. On the way we passed 2 sharks flapping about on the surface. After 7 hours the tower on the hill above Blaines came into view, and half an hour later we were moored in the marina. In town, the €6 menu de dia in the Chinese restaurant was a joy, and a little weird as we had the place to ourselves. Our bateau, which is French for boat, had now become a barco vela in Spanish, the friendliness of the people being a marked contrast to France. Next day was a 35-mile hop to Barcelona, where we intended to spend a week sightseeing. Our first sight of Barcelona was a cloud of pollution hanging over the city. Then the twin towers behind the Porto Olimpico where we were heading. We weren't expected and the girl on the check-in didn't want to let us in. After sweet talking her, she relented and we reversed into our berth alongside an Australian round-the-world boat. 4 hours after we arrived, Captain Rod chugged in and moored across the other side of the marina. I smelled another boozy evening. We liked Barcelona, the boardwalk into the infamous Barceloneta, where I bought a new mobile phone, as ours wouldn't operate in Spain, past the other marina, the Velport, where almost every boat had been robbed from, then into the Rambla, with its pavement artists, living statues, etc. Charlie Chaplin held up a sign for €1 when I pointed the camera at him, then turned his back when I shook my head. There was a UK chart agent, so we stocked up on Spanish charts. In the Rambla, there was a massive internet cafe run by EasyJet with over 200 terminals. Margaret was in shopping heaven. A visit to the zoo was called for as we had heard of the albino gorilla called Snowflake. When we reached his enclosure, there was a sign saying closed for cleaning. We learned later, however, he had died. The other exhibits were behind glass, so photographing them was difficult. Our week in Barcelona slipped by, so we cast off for our next stop, Tarragona, 50 nautical miles distant. 10 miles out, the sunny weather gave way to wind and rain. By the time we reached the Port Esparto marina, the wind was over 15 knots, so berthing was going to be difficult again. We used the VHF radio to advise them we were coming in, and a marinaro was sent to help us to moor up. We checked in, and as the price was only €13 a night, we decided to eat out. At that time the euro was about 1.60 to the pound. Happy days. In town, our jinx struck again. I was using the internet and managed to lock Margaret's bank account, so we couldn't access it until we reached our permanent destination and received surface mail. After lunch the next day the weather cleared and we cast off for Calafat, 22 miles distant. We chose Calafat as it was the last marina before the Rio Ebro Delta, where the pilot book warns to keep at least 4 miles offshore, as there are shifting sandbanks. As an example, a coastal lighthouse built in 1928 is now a mile inland. We passed a nuclear power station just before Calafat. Sailing past the marina entrance, we reversed our course and motored in and tied up to the fuel dock. The dock had car tyre fenders, which left black streaks down our port side. The weather closed in once more, a storm forecast for the whole of the Med. We booked in for 2 days. The cost had doubled to €26 a day. We actually departed after 3 days at €78 poorer for Vinaroz at 46 miles or Fuentes at 50 miles. We circled the Rio Ebro, which added 4 hours to our journey, but we also managed to sail wing a wing. This is accomplished when the wind is dead astern. We were bowling along at 7.5 knots on the GPS. This is how sailing in the Med should be. 4 miles out from Fuentes the rain began. As we came through the entrance there was an unusual rolling motion. 12 hours later we knew why. The Capitanery has a distinctive shape like a pair of sails. The weather report was still iffy, so we booked in for 2 days. Exploring the town we found an English fish and chip shop called Cheers, Manna from Heaven. Margaret had cod and chips and mushy peas, but I settled for Spanish tagliatelle and pork medallions. An English couple with an apartment on the marina invited us for drinks. The rain blew out the electricity hourly, and 30-foot rollers were washing across the entrance. The rain in Spain sure didn't fall on the plain. It fell on us. 3 days later we were off once more. Destination Silas, which I described as Steptoe's Yard in my book. We moored outside the office and 2 marineros assisted, then advised us there was no fuel or facilities to pay for a night's stay. "You will have to pay at the bank in Valencia, or you no need to pay at all." Sounded like a request for a bribe. On your bike, I thought. Next day the 18-mile trip to Valencia was a milk run in comparison to some of the trips. Valencia, Spain's 3rd largest city, loomed out of the haze around 11 a.m. The marina we were heading for was past the main port, and as we entered the bay we found it full of yachts. It was race day. It was siesta time as we pulled in for fuel. The miserable marinero didn't want us to use our fuel filter as it slowed down the filling process. We took on 40 litres, then reversed to the visitors' pontoon next to a wooden Swedish sail training boat. Tied up, then the heavens opened. The sun broke through late afternoon as the 12th crew from the Swedish training boat arrived with 4 shopping trolleys full of food for their next leg. The shops were miles away from the marina. On Sunday morning we trudged through the heat to collect fresh bread and cakes. 3 days later we left for the 42-mile run to Denia. There are 2 sections to Denia Marina. The cheaper fishing port was off to starboard, so we tried there first. It was too small for our 40-foot length and 12-foot 6 beam, so we turned to port to the new expensive marina. After tying up, I set off to find the Capitanery in 35-degree heat. After half an hour I found it. It was closed. Eventually we got a place next to a German motor cruiser. As we were reversing in, Margaret managed to bang her head on his satellite dish, spoiling the owner's afternoon TV. He was not amused. However, he made friends later. Denia is a beautiful place with its mountainous backdrop, so I inquired how much to stay for the year. £3,250 I was quoted, too rich for our blood. The out-of-season daily rate though was only €11. By 9 AM next morning we rounded the magnificent Cabo San Antonio. We were now in the Costa Blanca. Next stop, Altea. I called Altea on the VHF and told them of our imminent arrival and the need for fuel, and was told to tie up at the fuel dock. We complied and waited 10 minutes. The fueling dock was empty. I called the office again. Apparently we were at the fish dock fueling point. A quick trip across the harbour where we performed our synchronised docking act. Things were getting easier. An English resident in the adjacent yard took us into town in his car so we could post our mail. The following day we made the 30-mile trip to Alicante. You could almost smell the fish and chips. Our reception on arriving at Alicante brought us down to earth. The girl on reception flatly refused to give us a berth. I flashed my Liverpool Yacht Club membership card and quoted the law of the sea, where a port was duty-bound to give shelter when needed. Eventually she relented, and we were allowed to remain at the visitors' pontoon overnight. There was another marina over the other side of the harbour, but this was owned by the Club Nautico of Spain, and only for Spanish residents. After phone calls and emails, I found our next port, Torrevieja, had a berth for the night, and Aguadulce in Almeria could put us up for a year's stay. Who bloody ray! Following a Chinese meal and a disturbed night's sleep from the noisy nearby disco, we left for Torrevieja. A comparatively easy 30-mile run brought us to the outer harbour. I called on the VHF saying I wanted to refuel before berthing. The officious twerp said no. Berth, book in, then refuel. The Marinaro was on the visitors' pontoon, indicating where we were to go. In a strengthening wind we reversed in. As we squeezed in, he changed his mind. The mooring chain was faulty on that berth. This was repeated twice over, so I was pretty peed off when we finally tied up. However, the usual westerly was blowing a hoolie, so we made a short hop to Campamar. This meant we had to make a hard 40-mile slog into a 25-knot headwind to Cartagena. 4 hours later, somewhat battered and bruised, we arrived, which is also a Spanish naval base. Bet that woke you up. Every morning and evening at 6, that happened at the naval base. No lying here. A 2-mile walk to the town's Carrefour hypermarket and getting lost in the red light area on the way back are the memories from here. We were now on the homeward leg. One more stop and we would be at our home port, Aguadulce. But once again the jinx followed us into Garrucha. At 1600 hours we sighted the Garrucha breakwater. There was a German yacht on our starboard beam racing us for the entrance. Obviously he wanted to get his towel on a deck chair before us. The German upset the marinero with his tactics, so we refueled, sympathised with him, then made our way back to a berth, which was as tight as the proverbial duck's bottom. We had to remove our fenders to get in. Next morning we left early. It was 57 miles to Aguadulce, our longest trip since Corsica. Pilot book warns of a wind phenomenon in the Cabo de Gata area. Sure enough, as we neared the Cabo, the wind rose to 30 knots on the nose, which dropped our speed down to 4 knots and increased our ETA by 6 hours. After slogging into it for an hour, we reversed course and returned to Garrucha, passing another stalwart trying to do the same thing. There was a place vacant opposite our previous berth, so we tied up. Half an hour later, the marina captain came to tell us the place we were in was for a 10-metre boat. We were 11.9 metres, and a strong westerly was forecast. We prepared by relocating the fenders. The wind rose, yachts were coming in one after the other and having to go out into the storm because there was no room. Once more, our fenders saved us from damage. This Australian wouldn't take no for an answer and squeezed it into the place we had vacated. The weather report for the next 2 days was bad, so we stayed put, frustrated as our home port was so near. On Friday the 24th of May 2002 we left Garrucha for the second time for the 57-mile trip to Aguadulce. The wind was light and we were making 5 knots. As we neared San Jose the wind started to rise. Oh no! Not another turn back. We reached Cabo de Gata, cutting the corner and saving a couple of miles. We were now in Almeria Bay. The wind was on our port beam, so with sails raised we let her have her head, and we raced along, our best sail yet. We could now see Aguadulce in the haze. I called them on the VHF. Yes, our berth was ready, just check in at the Capitanary. We tied up to the visitors' dock, and in the Capitanary met the glamorous receptionist Teresa. She booked us in and allocated berth 717 on the seawall. The chief marinero, Jose, was waiting at our berth, which was next to an American tartan yacht. We reversed in safely and Jose got an extra large tip. We were finally here, our home for the next 12 months. In hindsight, would we do it again? Give me half the chance. Whoops! Look away, ladies.